Good morning.
Good morning.
To Representative Pitts. We appreciate you coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I know you've been here before, but perhaps once again, we can go around the table and introduce ourselves. I'm Suzanne Cassidy. I'm the opinion editor at LNP.
Tim Smuldrer, staff writer at Lancaster News, LNP.
I'm John Kirkpatrick. I'm the president of LNP.
I'm Tom Merce, the content editor.
Barb Hoferetta, I'm the executive editor.
Joe Hinkle, deputy opinion editor.
Jeff Hawks, reporter.
Thank you.
Well, Representative Pitts, again, thank you so much for coming. As you can imagine, there's a great deal of interest in our discussion here this morning. And I was wondering if you wanted to make any opening remarks about.
Well, just say thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad to have Steve, my new press secretary, here as an initiation for editorial boards. As you know, this is a controversial issue in Lancaster County, and there are lots of very legitimate concerns that have been raised by constituents, and I'm very happy to try to address any concerns that they have and get them to the right people. So I'll be happy to talk to you about anything.
So do you continue to see that as your role, to convey concerns, not necessarily to express your own?
Yes. The FERC process, which applies to interstate pipelines, not intra, but across state lines, is designed to minimize or really not permit political influence. And so my main role has been to make sure the process works for any concerned citizens. And so when they raise concern, and I get them calling the office or writing, we try to give them good advice, be an honest broker, get the information in a timely manner to the appropriate people. So I think I'm more effective doing it that way than if I took a for or against position. I think I can be viewed as an honest broker by people who are in the process. And I might mention, I didn't know this until checking. The pipeline goes through 5 different congressional districts, and they're all taking the same position. I didn't know that until this week when I checked. So I think the philosophy is that we're really more effective at getting their concerns considered than if it were to try to be a political process.
I'm curious as to what you've been hearing most from your constituents, the biggest concerns, and where you send them.
Well, the biggest concerns are from the impacted landowners. I represent 94% of Lancaster, and so most of the people in the county aren't impacted. So the concerns I'm getting are primarily from landowners along the cartway. And we hear a number of concerns. The latest has to do with Indian burial sites. So as they arise, we try to direct them in an appropriate way. So, but impact on farms is one. Safety is another. The process of how they can engage is another.
Congressman, a theme that runs through a lot of the questions that we've received from readers is the sense that the deck is stacked against them. And if you don't mind if I could read this letter, one question from a reader who writes, how can Representative Pitts say that the FERC process is fair when they never reject a project and when it is stacked with industry people?
Well, first of all, FERC can reject the process. And so they will, they're in different phase after they apply, and they're in that process of looking. And the law requires FERC to make a decision as to whether this pipeline is absolutely necessary or not. They have to make that decision if they approve it. It is designed for them to look at pipelines across state lines in a way that they look at the facts and the science and the needs and come to a conclusion. The Williams partners, the people putting in the pipeline, can decide to change, the route. But FERC could come in later and just, disapprove. So there are a number of opportunities for citizens to become engaged in that whole process. My advice to them is be fully engaged. When FERC comes out, you'll see on their website when and where you need to engage with them. They have to listen to you. And I know all of the FERC commissioners are politically appointed. They're all appointed by the president, by President Obama, in fact. And so I don't know them individually, so I can't really tell you how fair they really are. But they're tasked to be fair. I mean, that's their job, to try to be fair in listening to all the various concerns. So I don't think that you should necessarily assume that the deck is stacked against you, if you want to engage. I know we do need infrastructure projects. You would not have rail lines or phone lines or electric lines or oil lines or pipelines if you didn't have a system where you could build infrastructure in this country. And that's the way it's been since George Washington ordered the canal system built or the national road system. We do need infrastructure. So if you mean stacked about having infrastructure, we do need infrastructure, because to get the electricity or the oil or the heat or the natural gas necessary from the gas fields to the East Coast, the pipelines have to go somewhere. And pipelines are much safer than rail lines for transporting these things. So the system is designed to look at whether we need that infrastructure. That's true.
Congressman,
Yeah.
without taking a stand on the pipeline project itself,
Yeah.
can you say whether or not you are comfortable with the current route of
I've had concerns about some of the route, and I've raised those concerns to Williams, and they've made some adjustments, I understand. So in talking to some of the landowners that are impacted, we have 5 major pipelines right now that go across the county and 2 minor ones. And they've never had any problems. And I think the environmental groups, the agencies, the people involved have been effective in producing a process of having the pipelines even safer over the years. But where landowners have contacted me I've tried to advocate for them with Williams.
Some of the concerns we've heard from advocates for the landowners are, for example, many of them are Amish farm owners who are not, normally, that's not part of their, the way they operate. To call their congressman, to write, many of them don't have phones. The land is everything to them. Do you share their concern, their fears for this
Well,
very rich farmland?
I share that concern, but I meet on a regular basis with the leaders of the Amish, and meet with the Amish and have town meetings with them, every year. I give them access and try to advocate on behalf of them and their concerns. And we have a very historically rich area. And I think Williams has to do what is necessary to preserve that. We have to take that into consideration. So the main thing I've tried to do is get people to talk to each other, to raise the issues with the appropriate parties. And I don't use the noise and pressure tactics. I don't believe in that noise and pressure and demagoguery tactics. Some people do. I try to deal in a relational way, get to know people, get to try to have their trust, try to advocate for them, and talk without raising your voice, and I think that works a lot better.
To follow up on that in terms of the farmland, we heard concerns from Farmland Trust, advocates, people who work for Farmland Trust. And they pointed out that pipelines are not permitted on federally preserved farmland, but are permitted on farmland that's been preserved with, for example, Lancaster County taxpayer money. Do you think that's
That's
do you think
correct.
that's troubling?
No.
Well, can you explain it for people who
Yeah,
don't
well,
understand
the
why?
Farmland Ag Preservation Board of the county supports pipelines. I know the trust does not, but it is true, if there's a dime of federal money having been spent on a farm for preservation, pipelines can't go through those farms. And they're now doing a census to try to determine where those farms are. I'm not sure anybody really has a handle yet on where the farms are that a pipeline couldn't cross. But that's the status of the law, as I understand it. We've tried to address the concerns that the trust has raised and get information for them. But, the farmers, I've had very few farmers contact me about this. Most of the farmers who are impacted, I think, are fine with the pipeline. There are many of them that have pipelines going across their farms. And of course, they're compensated if there's any kind of impact that might be on the farm. I think they get like a 3-year payment in the first year, in the full first year, and so that there's no impact as far as the ability to grow crops on the farm. The pipeline's required when they dig up the property to separate the topsoil from the other soil and then replace it in a manner so that it will have the topsoil back that is most productive. And we try to help any of the farmers who contact us, but most of them seem to be fine with it. And I actually polled this issue last year, and the majority of the constituents in Lancaster County do support the pipeline. So I've got constituents on both sides, and I have both sides contact my office. Most of them have been the anti, and I try to help them.
The process that you described of removing and replacing the topsoil
Yeah.
in the pipeline, does that work? Is that just as effective for, say, farmers who use the no-till method?
I think so. As you know, a lot of farmers are going to no-till,
Right.
and it's much more effective. And, I think it's primarily so that they don't have to use chemicals, but they are better productive and less costly when they go to no-till.
As someone who's been involved in this, what do you see as the benefits to Lancaster County to having this pipeline as proposed by Williams?
Well, they can always put a port in it if they needed to serve Lancaster, but this pipeline goes across Lancaster.
Right.
Yeah, and I understand, although the consumer will determine, not Williams, they don't sell gas, it's the consumer that will determine where the gas goes. I understand probably 80% of it will be for domestic use and some perhaps to overseas supplying and getting over to Europe for countries like Ukraine that are under the influence of Putin and his extortion tactics. So that would help, help that situation if that happens. But the consumer will decide, and it could go, south. It could go north. The way I understand it's being built, but it's primarily for, not in Lancaster,
Right.
but U.S. consumption. But when you've got all this gas in these big gas fields out west, and the market here, in the Northeast, the Atlantic, the pipeline has to go somewhere. And, they could say the same things with electricity, highways, other types of infrastructure too. Unfortunately, it's got to cross somewhere.
So you don't feel, other than what this does for the good of our country or the good of our national defense, that there's much in particular that it helps?
Not in the immediate. They could open up a port and serve in the future, but I don't think this is designed to serve our area.
That is another frustration, I think, reflected in many of the questions that were conveyed to us today. One gentleman writes that Williams Company's pipelines and compressor stations have had a history of explosions and leaks, and they have paid millions of dollars in federal fines. Why would we want them in Lancaster County exposing thousands of residents to these risks, especially when there is no long-term benefit to those of us who are bearing the risks?
Well, as I said, we've got 5 major pipelines crossing the county now, and we haven't had a problem. And I think their processes are even more secure than a 50-year-old pipeline. So I have confidence that they will build it in a manner that will be safe.
I have another question, I hope you don't mind, from one of the constituents. She writes, have you been in touch with Williams in regard to the disruption of our traffic patterns and roadways? My neighborhood is losing one of the only 2 ingress and egress points, and I'm terrified of being trapped in the event of a construction accident. So as you can see, there are real concerns for people about the real impact this is going to have. Have you?
The blocking of what? Egress?
Traffic patterns
Where?
and roadways.
Where's this?
She didn't note
Yeah, I'm not aware of that.
municipality.
I'm thinking, contact Malcolm, I'll raise it with them, but I'm not aware of that.
And then that same woman writes, if you have, what action have you taken to ensure that all the federal and state EPA guidelines will be followed? Is that part of the FERC process? Assessing the environmental impact?
Well, that's one of the requirements as FERC looks at approving, is to make sure all of the appropriate environmental impact studies have been done.
On a larger level, we have 5, this will, if this goes through, it'll be 6, right?
Well, there's
Pipeline.
7, 2 smaller,
Right.
5 larger.
And should there
And
be?
some of them go through people's backyards. I don't know.
I
if
think
you've
one
seen
goes
it.
through your backyard.
Yeah.
Side of my.
Side of your house.
Yeah, just right by your driveway. I mean, I've been out to see some of them. It's incredible. A lot of people don't know that they're there.
Do you think there's, I mean, is this just gonna be, is natural gas assumed, given the amount we have in Pennsylvania, New York? Do you see more pipelines? Do you think that the FERC process can really deal with the bigger picture of
Well,
where and how, what right of way should they be
this-
following or not?
This is really a function of the president's, policy of clean power. Natural gas is much cleaner than coal.
Right.
In Pennsylvania, we have, I think, about 58% redundancy with coal. And, I support alternative fuels like wind and solar, but sometimes the wind doesn't blow, sometimes the sun doesn't shine. You've got to have redundancy. When you come in here, you want the lights to go on, you want to have air conditioning. People use power more and more. And part of the result of shutting down coal-fired plants is increased use of natural gas because it's cleaner.
Right.
So we've got to have energy, our whole technology, our whole economy is built on the need for good, reliable energy. And this is clean, much cleaner than coal. Now, I support all forms. I think we can clean and do it in an environmentally sensitive way all of our forms of energy. And we need to do that. We just can't have only alternative sources and make it. And we need to improve all of them, in my opinion. It is a matter of national security as well, not to be so dependent on foreign sources of energy. Our friends in the Middle East, the sheikhs or Venezuela, wherever it comes from, Russia. I think it is in our national interest to develop our own resources and be energy independent. And we can easily do that with all the resources we have if we set our minds to it.
I have another question from a reader who asks, again, I think, this feeling of I have the odds being stacked against them comes through again in this one. She asks, could you please explain to people how a for-profit corporation's desire to make money trumps the rights of individual landowners and business owners? And I think by business owners, they would even include the many farmers have expressed the Farmland Trust that they're not happy about the pipeline, that they have concerns about how it's going to impact the running of their long-held family farms.
Well, I don't think there's going to be an impact if you're talking about production, agriculture, on what they can produce in the long term. I've visited with farmers who have pipelines going across their farms, and you couldn't even tell if they didn't tell you. And there's certainly no long-term impact on the yields. But private companies, as I said, with infrastructure projects, whether they're electric or phone or rail or pipeline, are engaged in our economy. And we utilize their products. That's not unusual. I don't think the government should own everything. The government should control everything. So there is an appropriate role for manufacturers and producers of energy to be able to get their market to product. I don't think that's wrong. I mean, look at the highway system that we have. It's fantastic. Look at our phones, look at our electric grid. And we can improve them, we should, but it's very important for our economy that we be able to function this way. And we're not a banana republic. Politicians shouldn't be able to control everything. And the process that we have in the law is to minimize political influence. In fact, they're not supposed to have any political influence. Politicians shouldn't have influence. It should be done by regulators who have to look at the facts and sound science and make a decision, an informed decision. And what I've done is try to make sure my constituents understand and can get through that process. And I have not tried to mislead them by using tactics that are unproductive.
You mentioned before that you have held town halls with the Amish farmers.
About once a year.
Okay, about once a year. A couple of people have asked if you would consider doing a town hall on this issue with other constituents. Do you not see much use in that?
Well, I understand tactics. I've been doing this a while. And I understand how people like to set you up. Goes with the territory. What I have done is said I will meet with anyone who's interested and impacted. And I really have not chosen to do a meeting where the opponents will misuse the opportunity, in my opinion, to demonstrate or try to put undue pressure. I don't know if you saw the campaign and all the signs. That wasn't by the people who were for it. I understand the noise and pressure game. I just have chosen to do this with anyone who wants to meet. I'll be happy to meet with them and try to advocate on their behalf.
I keep getting questions, so are you okay, continue to ask questions from readers? And I will say, Congressman, these are people we haven't heard from before. These aren't the usual people, which I think is interesting. This reader asks if you've ever visited people living on the Marcellus Shale who've been negatively impacted by the natural gas industry. And she says that this pipeline will only increase impacts in these areas through increased drilling. What will you do to help your constituents in the path of the pipeline to make sure that their lives aren't negatively impacted?
No, I haven't visited people impacted by Marcellus Shale. I don't think we have a well within 100 miles in a district. But if you look at the whole issue of hydraulic fracking, there have been some misconceptions out there. They drill down about 8,000 or 9,000 feet, and they put the casing in the concrete floor, and the groundwater may go down maybe 1,000 feet, so it's much lower. And they've been using this technology for decades and decades. The environmental damage has been when they spill up on top some of that liquid that they use when they force it down and force into the fractures. And that's a violation of law, and they've been you know, environmental agencies in the state have been very rigorous in going after anyone who has impacted or polluted through those kinds of incidents, and they should. But if you're talking, I don't know any other kind of impact unless you're maybe talking about road use, because there's been increased road use around a lot of the wells. But in talking to people that represent that area, other areas of the state, they have said that there's a vast amount of support for the drilling of natural gas in their regions.
I'd like to go back, I guess, just one more time, because this has come up in numerous ways with people calling and writing and talking
Sure.
about this. Your comfort level with the process, the FERC process, that it is a fair process, that it will listen to the people, that it will be an informed decision as opposed to what many critics call rubber stamp.
No, I really do believe that the process is such that it will be fair and informed. I've had this happen in other parts of my district previously. Now, on one of the lines in Chester County in my district a few years ago, I asked FERC to come and hold a hearing, and they did that. Now, I asked them to do it on this one, and they turned me down. So, I'm not sure why, but.
Did you ask for an explanation?
I think they felt maybe at that time it was too early in the process.
So
That was before the application. It was last year.
Okay. Will you re-ask for a hearing?
I'd be happy to. Basically what we did was we had a high school auditorium, and we had let anyone who was concerned come and speak. And I didn't really broker it. I acted sort of an MC, but it was very vigorous, and FERC was very responsive.
And that was the FERC commissioners, or just their?
One of them.
One of them.
I didn't get my file.
If I could revisit the soil question, I'm not going to ask you to get into the technical aspects of soil, but in Lancaster County, we believe that much of this preserved farmland, the soil is particularly rich. It's
Class 1 soil is the best soil
Right.
in the country. We have it in Chester County too.
right. So the feeling is that this is such a precious resource that we shouldn't be messing around with it, because someone last week told us that it can take years for the soil to recover after no-till soil, after it's been disrupted. Isn't there any other way of putting these pipelines in? Do you think the whole idea of...
You mean above ground?
No, I'm sorry, using existing right-of-ways, for example, do you think that's been fully explored by OEMs? Because I think the perception here is they're just taking this rich soil because it's an easier and cheaper place to put the pipeline in instead of all existing right-of-ways, for example, which might be more complicated but wouldn't be as disruptive to farmland.
Yeah, I think the disruption is going to be temporary, and after a couple of years, I don't think people even notice any difference, because they're replacing the topsoil on top of the ground. It's just like when you plow a farm, you turn the soil over. This is just a little bigger, of course, production, and so they're taking off the topsoil, separating it, and then when they put it back in, they're putting the topsoil back on top. So I think the disruption will be minimal. It could happen that there's less productivity for a year or two, and the farmers have been compensated for, I think, 3 years to make sure that they're not affected. And farmers I've talked to like it. You know, they're happy with the process. Not all of them, but most of them are happy.
You talked about the responses that you're getting in your office from
Yeah.
constituents. Maybe you have looked at numbers on this. Can you give us any sense of, are you getting more calls from folks who have concerns or are directly influenced by this, or is it more people who are supportive?
No, most of them are against. And we've had about 1,700 contacts
Okay,
since the beginning.
okay,
Of course, there are not that many landowners impacted,
right,
but some is organized.
okay,
But in talking to groups, whether it's farm groups or farmers or individuals, you get a mile away from the cartway. A lot of people don't even know what's happening. So, and then when you polled those, you see that reflected in the polling. So what we do, if anybody's impacted, we're on that hard and immediately to make sure their concerns are addressed. Those are the ones that I've told my staff are first priority. We've got to make sure that we advocate on their behalf, and we can do that. That's permitted in the law to make sure that their concerns are part of the process.
And I do have another question, and I'm going to try to prod you. We'll see how well I do. You talked a little bit about, and I think this maybe gets more maybe to just philosophy of representative government. But you talked about politicians should not, in this case, you didn't feel that they should have an influence, and that we should be looking at the facts and at the sound science. And I certainly think it would be hard to dispute the idea that we should be looking at facts and sound science. But with all due respect, I think in most issues that come up, whether they're state, local, or federal, politicians do tend to have an opinion, and they do tend to try to exert influence. And I'd like for you to talk to a little bit more about, there's just been a real craving and even understanding that maybe others of your colleagues have taken the same tack that you have. But there has been, I think, a sense of disappointment on the part of constituents here that you haven't come out, been even more of a vocal advocate for the process one way or the other, or in representing the opinions of constituents here. And I just wondered if you could just speak to that a little bit more.
Okay, first, as I said, most of my constituents favor the pipeline. I polled it. Right? So what I do, I've got two groups. I think I'm more effective at advocating as an honest broker without being an advocate for or against. I think I am believed by the regulators more, even the Williams people more, because I don't have an axe to grind. And on other pipelines, I've taken this same position and found it the most effective. Now, it's easy to rail against. It's easy to demagogue. I mean, politicians know how to do that. I just think it's less effective. And the system that has been passed by law, by Congress, is such that it is to eliminate political influence, or you would not have highways or the other infrastructure that I mentioned. So I think the process is valid, because we do need infrastructure, and we need somebody to make an informed decision who's being fair, trying to make the right decision as to what is really needed. Now, this is a interstate pipeline. Intrastate are controlled by the PUC, not FERC, and they are political. So in local pipelines that are controlled by the PUC, you see a different process. And there is political influence there. I don't want to deny that doesn't happen.
Congressman, again, though, given that FERC never turns these proposals down,
Well, I don't know, they're withdrawn.
it's rare though, right? There is, again, this continuing feeling that this is a rubber stamp procedure. Is there a process, is there anything that you would change if you were in charge of the process? Is there anything that you would change about it to kind of counter that perception that everyone's just going through the motions, this is going to happen no matter what they say?
Well, maybe the only thing I would change is that FERC ought to have a balance on their commission. They're all appointed by President Obama now. I would require maybe a 3-2, have a little bit more balance of philosophy.
A 3-2 what?
The appointments.
Based on party affiliation?
Yeah, based on their philosophical leanings. But I'm not going to criticize what FERC does because I think most of these people are really trying to do the right thing.
So again, you're fairly comfortable with the process? You're comfortable
Yes.
with the process as it is?
Yeah.
I know your time is short, and we've talked all about the pipeline. But could I ask a
Sure.
different? We're sitting here, the Iranian deal, the potential Iranian deal, there's a lot going on in Washington. Could you just talk a little bit about
Yeah, I had
the
a
views from
classified
Washington to Lancaster County residents?
Yeah, I had a classified briefing. I think it was last week, but days run together here. Was it this week, Andrew? This week?
Yeah.
Okay, Secretary Kerry and the entourage of the administration are negotiating this agreement. We're there. This is not a treaty. We don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. This is an agreement. And I think we have to give the president some latitude in reaching this agreement until we know what's in it. He's got another 9 weeks of negotiations. They've agreed to a framework, but they're still dealing with details. And the Senate acted this week to make sure that whatever the agreement is, Congress has to approve. So we will get to, once we see the agreement, decide yes or no. And I think based on what I heard, and I can't talk about classified stuff, but that I am much more comfortable with what is occurring after listening to the details. I don't think we should trust Iran. They cheat. They're a sponsor of terrorism, state sponsor of terrorism. We've got to verify everything. And it is a very dangerous situation if we permit them to get on a path for a nuclear weapon. To have a nuclear weapon would cause, I think, a weapons nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and that makes it very, very dangerous, because what is happening now with the rise of ISIS and what's happening in Yemen is they're almost starting a Shia versus Sunni war, and that could be absolutely devastating to the region. So I think we need to do everything we can, working with our allies, to make sure, and the UN, to make sure that Iran is not on a pathway towards developing a nuclear weapon.
Well, what's your Congress's, I'm sorry.
I was just curious as to, the world looked one way a year ago, now with ISIS, it looks another way. And allegiances and alliances are shifting.
Yeah.
that seemed unimaginable a few years ago. And does that play a role? Does ISIS play a role in how we look at Iran? And
Yeah, you have old traditional alliances that have been fracturing. For instance, you had with Egypt, with the president there, Mubarak, for 30 years, who was an ally who worked with us on the peace process with Israel and the Palestine. And then we unfortunately undermined that administration and put a situation where the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge, and then the people overturned that because of their violation of constitutional provisions. And I think this new general, al-Sisi, is much better. I think, but we don't support it. I do think we should support our allies with equipment and training, like the King of Jordan or the President of Egypt. What happened in Libya? Libya's a basket case. It's a huge country. It's now the source of lots of arms and fighters going, especially into the northern African countries. I meet with some of my ambassador friends, and they said, why don't you do something? The U.S. should do something. And there's a perceived lack of engagement, leadership that they are hungry for. And weakness, as you can see with Putin, invites aggression. We need to be strong. But it is concerning to see what's happening in Libya and Egypt and Syria, and now this thing with ISIS occurring. I would favor a strategy of encouraging our allies to go after ISIS by providing the kind of air support that we can provide.
Jeff, I'm sorry.
Just your thoughts on what Secretary Kerry has achieved so far. Give him space to work this out?
I would, yes. After listening to the briefing, I was of an opinion that they were making progress.
And is it premature for Congress to?
Oh, yeah, I don't think we should be engaged in diplomacy. I think we need to wait until they come up with their agreement before we vote on it. At the water's edge, the R&D ought to stop. We're Americans. Let's let our administration do what they think they can do. And then, once we see it, we can make a decision. I think it's a little premature.
I'm curious about your political plans. Will you run again?
We have a tradition, and we've been asked by our chairman of the parties that we don't talk about the next election before this election. So we're in process this year. After that, we'll make a decision. Talk about the next election. But I'm raising money. If you want to know, I've had a good first quarter. You may not like to hear this, but I have a fundraiser or two every week in Washington. It's what you have to do to raise funds. My last one was very successful. I raised a lot of money in my last one. I think as chairman of the health committee, it helps me. It's easier, to be honest. People do want to talk to me.
In terms, I'm sorry, by
Raising money.
raising money.
You can only raise little chunks at a time, but more people want to see you. So they'll come to breakfast or lunch or whatever. None of you are aware of what happened with the SGR. Same growth rate, the top picks, Medicare reimbursement rates for seniors.
Were you relieved to see that happen?
I led the effort for 4 years. I tasked my subcommittee to develop this vehicle. It took us 2 years to do it. It was bipartisan. It came out last session 51-0, passed the House, went to the Senate, barely killed it because we didn't agree on the pay-fors. we were able to negotiate the pay force this year. It's primarily Speaker Boehner and Nancy Pelosi, who negotiated that. And we worked it hard. We got 392 votes in the House for it, 37 against. And then this week, the Senate voted 92 in favor, 8 against it. We had our signing ceremony yesterday, the enrollment of the Speaker. So the President's going to, I don't know, he's going to sign it soon. Maybe he signed it already, I don't know. But it was a bipartisan effort and bicameral. We worked both sides of the Capitol, both sides of the chamber. And, you know, even in this atmosphere, this can be done. It just takes a lot more work to do that. It's a real significant effect on healthcare for seniors and doctors, retreat centers. Very, very important.
Okay, anything else?
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Pitts, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.